Hi, welcome to Pomeria's podcast, episode 1, Studio Radio. And today we will talk about landscape architecture, explore landscape architecture through another story. I'm Yanni.
And I'm Victor, and we're both from year one. So this is in total a three-part series. And in our first part, we have invited our senior lecturer, who Mr. Chan, we call him Yin-Lun. And then he also teaches us a course, which is in Introduction to Landscape Design. And we're very glad to have him as a guest today here in our podcast.
So, Yin-Lun, how about you introduce yourself?
Okay, yeah, well, hi, I'm Yin-Lun. What do you want to know about me?
Okay, so we basically want to know, as a lecturer in Hong Kong U, how did you become a landscape architect? And we've heard from you. I don't know if our audience have heard from you that you were originally studying to be an engineer, but then you've kind of crossed paths with landscape architecture and had a change of mind and decided to study landscape architecture. And we'd like to know more about why did you do that, and like how did studying engineering help you with landscape architecture, and overall your journey in landscape architecture?
That was over 20 years ago. But I think it's a good. Thank you for inviting me. I think it's a good chance for me to reflect a little bit on my own career, and more closer to you guys at the age of about 18, 20. What went through my education and in my career choices. So in my selection of subject to university, it's probably still that case now. Like around 2000, it was either finance or IT, right? And that was before IT bubble crashed. So most of my friends went to finance, right? And then ended up being bankers. But then I wanted to do something more hands-on, like something that's more tangible. So I went to engineering school. I started out studying civil engineering, and then I got interested in environmental aspects. So I had a specialization in environmental engineering, looking at water, things like that. And then partly I felt I had too much time in university. Well, from my memory.
I'm sure a lot of engineering students would disagree with that. Please continue.
Yeah, I don't know if my memory is kind of giving me wrong impressions of things, but I found differential equations and calculus not particularly difficult. So I had a bit of time to spare. So and then in my school, so I went to the University of Waterloo, and they had a double major program. I was just kind of walking down the hallway, and I saw this leaflet lying in the corridor that says, you can fulfill these courses, and then you can get a double major in geography. So I thought it was related enough, and then it's interested. It's what I'm interested in doing. So I did my second major in geography. Right? In the beginning, looking at more of the physical geography, climate, and hydrology, things like that. And then the path into geography got me into the more humanistic side of things. So I began to be interested in tourism, and other kind of economic geography, things like that. So I started become interested in cultural things. Well, and then I did my exchange term in Singapore, and then I was traveling in Thailand for a little bit, kind of looking for handicraft and kind of studying cultural artifacts in relation to tourism. Oh, and then at that time there was a comic called Hunter x Hunter.
Oh yeah.
Which is hasn't ended. Right. So so I was kind of like hunting for treasure, and then that was kind of my little game. So I was doing that towards the end of my university life. I was doing a bit of traveling, looking at cultural things, and then really looking at the intersection between landscape and culture and the kind of more physical and more cultural aspect of things. So when I was searching for graduate programs, I came across landscape architecture, right, which seems to be a natural combination of all the things that I'm interested in. So that was a bit of a sideway entry into landscape architecture. But I'm glad I made that choice. That was one of the most exciting decisions I think I've made in my life.
It's really cool. May I ask though? So since I myself I studied math, for a lot of math and calculus for the last few years of my high school, and I thought I was gonna go into engineering, but then I decided not to go into engineering. But when I'm studying landscape architecture, I still haven't been introduced to any math yet. So would you say transferring from studying engineering and doing differentials into something like landscape architecture, would you say you've wasted your time on math, or has it helped you in some ways in landscape architecture?
Well, I think everything I did was quite relevant in some ways towards the end. And partly we do a lot of collaboration, right? If we do larger scale projects, if we do drainage or river wetland projects, in the end it's a multidisciplinary collaboration. So anyhow, we need to work with ecologists and engineers, right? And for me, we need to, it's good to have a handle, so that we don't, we're not reliant on the engineer to tell you what's possible and not possible, right? So that there is an ability to carry on a conversation and more as a collaboration, rather than in kind of a typical impression, the designer is interested in what looks nice, and then the engineer would be responsible for making it work.
Yeah, there are a lot of jokes about that.
Yeah. But I think that's not necessarily the case. Although in design school I do sometimes feel that the technical part is a little bit loose, because it is an kind of, it is probably not possible to have within the landscape program itself a lot of that hydrology kind of modeling and calculation. It kind of takes away from some of the other skills that you need to be trained. But on the other hand, we do see a lot of river water projects in design school that is being critiqued of being just beautifying the river. Right? When we talk about restoration, when we talk about, everyone sees the concrete channel, thinks it should be improved. Right? That's a very intuitive reaction. But then quite often the before and after photoshopping exercise leads to something that is not super convincing,
right,
for somebody who is technically trained. So I think having a bit of that background, although I don't really do those calculations anymore now, it's good to have that training. And math and logical training is good for people in general. Anyways, I think that's why you take math in high school.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, so it's actually your strength that you have knowledge in both fields compared to people who only pursue their degrees and masters in landscape architecture alone.
That would be a yes and no. In a way, landscape architecture is very multidisciplinary, right, to begin with. For a long time, we had only a graduate program. So the program in Hong Kong U started as a Master of Landscape Architecture for a long time, before there is the bachelor's program. And that's similar in the North American case as well. And that's why, for me, it's not so much a career change, because most of my classmates entering the MLA program is from a related or not so related discipline. Right? There's the guy who sits next to me was a philosopher, right? And he's a poet, right?
Imagine a poet doing landscape architecture.
Still arts.
Yeah.
So very poetic in a way, but no, that was a very interesting person. Like, he was a city councilor in some United States. I forgot where exactly, Nevada or somewhere. But anyway, so he's a councilor, he's a politician, and he's a philosopher and poet. So he was very good at presenting anything. Like, he can talk through anything. So even if he doesn't have a design, he can present
Entertaining.
yeah, so that's a very good skill. So I'm digressing, right? So what was the question? The question was whether it's the multidisciplinary, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? And what I was going to say in that I said it was yes and no, because sometimes I feel like I am all over the place in a way. So I'm not specialized in a very defined discipline from the very beginning, which I think by nature landscape architecture is multidiscipline, and then for a graduate program design where everybody comes from a different background, it's kind of natural that nobody is in my education, not a lot of people like yourself are trained from university year one as landscape architects, right? So in a way, I sometimes feel like I'm spending a lot of time in many different places that doesn't give me a very focused. So imagine if the past 20 years I have a much narrower academic focus, then I would probably have been more productive in what I do. Right? So probably more publication, and then more built projects on a particular. So if I'm an expert in a particular very specific area, then I can call myself a very much an expert in that particular thing, right? So it's, for example, if I make paper cups for 20 years, then I'm paper cup master.
Yeah.
So having kind of gone through different trajectories, done different things, I still feel like I have experience and I have exposure to a lot of different things, but in if you ask me what is my particular expertise, I still have a bit of trouble answering that question.
Jack of all trades.
Right, but in a way, I feel like landscape architecture by its nature is also a little bit like that, because you need to put your hands on everything, and therefore sometimes it feels like you're not an expert in a particular small area. But the plus side is a the person kind of holding everything together.
Okay, that's a good transition into my next question, which is, may I ask if you have done any work in North America, like after you graduated?
Yeah, I worked in the city of Vancouver
for
a little bit.
So right now you're working in Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm.
So which leads to my question is there like a difference in culture regarding in the landscape architecture field, in the work industry of landscape architecture? Is there a difference between the North America side or in Hong Kong? Because I think a lot of our students, whether in the bachelor program or in the master's program, have considered like going overseas or studying in the North American side and studying landscape architecture there after graduating the bachelor program or working over there. So could you like point out some differences or similarities between Hong Kong and maybe the North American side of landscape architecture?
Right. I saw this question in the email, right?
Yeah.
And this is one of the most difficult question, I think, because there is probably not a very simple answer. There are some obvious answers, but they're not kind of hitting the core of the matter, I think. But then we can probably go with the obvious ones first.
Sure.
Because obviously, it's density and verticality. Right? So one of the main things is when we design parks in Canada, there's always this opening party where you invite all the neighbors and everyone, all the participants of the project to the opening party, right, on a nice day, and then there's a lot of children, a lot of kind of festive atmosphere, and then you take a lot of pictures, and then the next day it becomes a very quiet, very nice place, which is not bad, right? If you go to a park, which is kind of basically like a quiet place, it's not a particularly bad thing. But then if the intention is to have a lot of program or have a lot of people activity in the park, then suddenly when I was studying in Canada and then I came back to Hong Kong and was traveling in mainland China, suddenly the parks are full of people, right? Whether they are dancing or tai chiing or playing chess, it's just full of activities. And that is a very nice quality. And then at some point you get a bit fed up. You're like, there's too many people, it's too crowded, and then it's too noisy. So there is that kind of contrast. But on the other hand, when your parks are always like quiet, tranquil, you're kind of looking for activity. You're looking for gathering as well. So that's kind of one of the main difference I experienced. Well, and then obviously when you're doing urban design, that's 4 stories. Like Vancouver likes 4 stories because that seems to be a good human scale type of design. And for Hong Kong, that's the lowest density you can possibly get, right? If you're doing new territories villages with 3 stories, that's the lowest kind of density. So in a way, designing or kind of going through urban landscapes in Hong Kong, I remember most of the time I show my friends around who like foreign friends around, they are typically amazed by how I go in and out of shopping malls and then go take different elevators and escalators, and then they basically got lost, and then I was kind of going this is east, right? So you go east. So I think those are some particular qualities of the landscape in Hong Kong. So therefore, if you're doing commercial practice, then you get a lot of podium gardens.
Wow.
Everything, a lot of things are on slab.
Yeah.
And then you have a lot of the work goes into working out circulation, things like that. So there's a density that's at the core of designing in basically urban landscapes in Hong Kong, versus the more extended green areas in a way. So the type of work is slightly different. But then, having said that, it's not the profession itself is not so different internationally, I think, because we are all coming out from there's a lot of shared kind of collective experience having work with architects and planners and all the related professions, landscape architects are in a kind of strange position. So this is a little bit of a carry extension from the previous discussion, right? Because if say I think in some ways many of the related professions are more defined in some ways. Like engineers do the math,
Yeah.
and then architects does the building, right? I think those are kind of relatively defined. And then as you have probably experienced in the class that I taught, that we just went through just right now, landscape is like everything. It's everything else, but everything or everything inclusive of the objects.
Yeah, it doesn't like have a clear boundary.
Right. So in a way, in school or in the way we think about landscape, we tend to think about everything, and we think everything is related to what we do. But in practice, it's not so clear because you're kind of stepping on everyone else's territory. So the most clear thing in practice, in the end, is plants. If we don't, if we kind of ignore the arborist and the ecologists for a little bit, for the moment, in the construction professional, between the construction professionals, we are, when it gets to plants, then we'll go ask then get the landscape architect, right?
Yeah.
Oh, we need to fell a few trees.
Always
Then or if it's like a planting design kind of problem, then but then in practice we get quite often we also get the landscape architect to just hide it, right? We plant something green in front of it, right? So we get a little bit of that. So there is a little bit of a disconnect between the way we would like to understand landscape design and how it fits into the commercial world, where we need to define who does what and who gets how much of the fees. Right? So again, I forgot the question. What was the question?
We kind of took to another area. That's because I was asking the question, like the difference in studying
Right.
architecture.
Right. Yeah. So yeah. No, my point from that is that there is a lot of similarities, although some of the geographical context, the way that landscape architects position themselves within the economy or within the way that development processes operate is very similar. And the other funny thing I find interesting is, even though we would think that temperate and subtropical and tropical climates would have very different plants, actually not really. Well, of course, there's a slightly different palette, but then a lot of the genuses you can relate the plants. You can pick the plants up quite quickly. So obviously, what we miss in the hotter parts of the world is the very strong fall colors, and then so in winter time it's all branches, and then summertime you have all the flowering, and then so very clear season. So I think it's a good thing that in Hong Kong we do have a bit of that seasonal change. So compared to like actual tropical, like Singapore, for example, they have a slightly less obvious seasonal change. So I think we get a bit of both, and there is actually quite a bit of overlap, even if we're talking about between climate zones 7 and 3. It's actually quite. There's still quite a lot of similarities, and then the interesting thing is that a lot of the North American plants, garden plants, which is all taken from United Kingdom and Europe, is also a lot of quite a lot of them has Chinese roots as well. So Beijing and London and Vancouver is kind of similar, and then between Guangdong, southern China, and Beijing, there is still quite a percentage of overlap of plants.
It's a very interesting point.
Mm.
So when when a landscape architect decides to move to Vancouver per se, so he won't have like a difficult time relearning all the plants.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
So,
There's still a lot of roses and rhododendrons.
yeah. So, but after all the like differences and similarities, and what are the factors that affect your decision in coming back to Hong Kong to work as a landscape architect?
Well, the simple answer is my family's here. So
That's important.
so that's that. And the past 10, 15 years, Hong Kong has gone through quite a bit of change as well, actually. So when I came back in 08, 09, it was directly after the Star Ferry and Queen's Pier kind of events. So for me, it was a bit of. I felt like I have an urge to participate in some of those discussions, like to practice, working in landscape architecture, and then also these kind of community land related issues. I was in Canada and I was following some of these events in Hong Kong, and I was writing a little bit about it. So for me, it was I wanted to participate, right? So I came back.
It's very cool.
But so for like the Star Ferry Pier issue, is this more of a field of like conservation, or how is it really related to urban planning or landscape architecture?
I think at the crux of the issue is how citizens or how collectively we decide on the future of our landscape. Right? So, well, conservation, yes, but it's a partly a political but also economic decision on what's worth keeping and what is not worth keeping, and how we want, for example, how we want historic central to look like. And this continues, right? Because there has been arguments in the 90s over whether you can reclaim more land. And then it's a fight over whether modernist architecture and our coastline is worth conserving because they are only 50, 60 years. The Star Ferry Terminal and the clock tower, etc. Right? So right now the post office is going through similar debates, but it's after 10, 15 years of that, the heated debates over the demolition of the Queen's Pier and Star Ferry. So I think what I was interested in and what I continue to work on is community processes. Although there are different ways of understanding, and I think given the 10, 15 years that have lapsed, a lot of NGO groups and a lot of people have picked up on these community design, community processes, and there needs to be engagement, participation. The government has also, I think, put a lot of resources into consultation or engagement. And then the way that the citizenship in general, the way they look at the resources that should be put into conservation of historical buildings has changed quite a bit as well. But in the end, it's about bottom-up planning versus top-down planning. So it's about people being able to make decisions on how their landscape looks like and how their living environments should be like. So yeah, so I think that is still at the heart of what I'm doing now and what I'd like to do.
Cool. So, okay, so here's a question I have myself after hearing like a couple of these discussions is so you've mentioned that in commercial, like in the working discipline, like when like they have troubles like hiding up things or have troubles or problems regarding to plants, they always call the landscape architects. Like what are your kind of opinions or point of views on this? Like, is this the direction like you would like landscape architecture to go in Hong Kong, or would you want to change it somehow, or have a different direction for it? Like,
yeah, I think the profession in general, a lot of people share a similar view that this is where we can stand very, this is the solid ground we can stand on, right? Including all the regulations and all the, well, basically, if you're a registered landscape architect, the main thing you can sign is the tree felling report.
Yeah.
Well, technically, but then basically, yes, right? Because building plans, we don't. Architects sign building plans, and then if it's a structural, then it's engineering, right? So the expertise of the landscape architect is felling trees. Okay, that's odd. but then the plant expertise is definitely something that the engineers and the architects and the planners know nothing about, right? In some ways, to put it simply. So that is where we can stand. So I think a lot of most landscape architects in Hong Kong would share, well, in the world actually, would share that it's one of the most fundamental knowledge that we can build our expertise on, right? So it's commercially, it's something people come to you to. So in whether in university education or in professional training, it's important that we get our plants knowledge up to speed. So that is important. That's where people look up to us on. But then once we use that as the like the ground where we stand, then I think we should take that up with confidence. Right? We use that to build up our power to create impact. So it's not about hiding undesirable views. It's about creating the ecology or creating the environments through living things, through plants, and then through ecology, and then through introducing these living elements into our environment. Because we are the only design discipline. Is that right? I think so. Okay, so we're the only design discipline with that designs with living things.
Yeah.
Right, so our palette is not only the rocks or the color or the kind of hard materials, but we design trees that will grow in 20 and 30 years. And so that's why in some of our discussion on landscape urbanism and the discussions surrounding it, we design with 20-year, 30-year, and 50-year scenarios, because the things that we put down, they start to grow themselves, and then if you go with an ecological kind of design that direction, then these ecologies self-sustain themselves. So in a way, that's also how we envision urban planning and community kind of design is that they kind of self-create, and they continue the design process that is not some decisions made by some master planner. So I mean, having said that, I think the power to build on the plant knowledge and then expand it to exert greater influence is something that is a promising trajectory. I think that is shared by quite a lot of the landscape architectural profession. So then, if you look at, I think a lot of current contemporary work on promoting landscape architecture and kind of consolidating the professional field is through work such as resilient design, responses to climate change. So in order to build on regenerative communities, etc. So that's where our expertise lies. So, but then partly is about, well, who are the actual the real clients who are funding these regenerative design and kind of long-term sustainability planning kind of thing. If the government is not so well, so there's a lot of advocacy work, and then I think a lot of different professional institutions and bodies are kind of working to turn these into real projects, and there are a lot of successful work put forward by a lot of people, and we're still working on it.
So you'd say it's heading in the landscape architecture discipline is actually heading in a pretty bright direction in general.
Oh, of course, of course. So, and that relies on every one of you, right? And to be confident, I think that's important.
Yes, true. So, you just mentioned that you want to talk about the CCCD. So, what's that?
So, well, that's related to the community type of work that I mentioned, right? So, besides practicing as a landscape architect, a lot of my time is spent on the group called the Center for Community Cultural Development, so CCCD. And part of that is related to what we've discussed, community planning, etc. But then community culture also looks at other aspects of community art as well. So that is also partly where I find my kind of confluence or intersection of interest, pointing to very exciting things, but then I kind of ran out of time to do everything together, right? But then the thing is, community culture or community arts, we deal with different communities and different art forms, right? So partly we have an anti-COVID festival that's happening. I don't know if that's the exact name of it. I don't haven't used the English term too much. Right? So there's a lot of these kind of because all these artists are kind of have no work. A lot of artists, a lot of theater workers are kind of have no work to do in the past 2 years. Right? So we're trying to create a platform. So if we're stuck online, then well, let's create art online. So and a lot of the different forms or the community kind of collective creative process. Well, so some of the things we do include community dance or community songwriting, like community music, community theater, are all a lot of different are the different things that we do across different art forms. But the center of that is that we don't rely on professionals. Like so, or in different ways. So there's high culture, like high art, gallery art, commercial art, and then on the other hand, you have popular culture. But then that's also a lot of money, right? That's a big market, movies and things like that. So what we believe in in doing community art is that everybody can participate in creating their own art. Right? So rather everyone watching television, consuming television, then we can create our own shows, and then we can all create and share, and that would be a much more meaningful kind of cultural exchange and production. So one of the projects that I tried to do, and I'm continuing to do that. I'm continuing to develop that. But then what I found in particular is some of the methods used in community theater is quite applicable to landscape architecture and urban planning and design. Right? Because in the theater of the oppressed, they do things like the image theater. So people like Augusto Boal, working active in the 60s and 70s, kind of traveled around South America, going to different villages, and then work with create theater with different people from different villages to tell their own story. And there is a set of techniques that they have developed to engage people who are not particularly artistic inclined, so they're not professionally trained actors, but they can through the workshops tell their own story. And there are things like the forum theater, where you would create a theater piece and then you invite the audience to enter, and then collectively you work out some problems. So for example, if it's like, say, a story of domestic violence, and then after you tell the story, you invite the audience to come in and try to solve the issue. Right? So in a forum theater setting, you would invite the audience to take the place of the actor, like of the story, of the main character, of the character in the story, and then try to act it out. Right? And then you can sort of run through different scenarios and try to create a solution. So so I was interested in borrowing some of these methods into urban planning and design, right, to have a collective discussion. Right? So rather than planning consultations where the planner show the scheme on the PowerPoint and then we draw on the map. So that's useful as well. But then we use Sharpie and we draw on the table. I thought these kind of personal stories, or kind of acting where you actually move your body and get involved into these settings, I thought this was quite interesting. So this is one of my project, is to combine these methods of community theater and community design, so that we have more tools to use in the way we discuss the future of our landscape.
It's really a great idea that everyone can participate in creating art together in the community.
May I ask, like, how did that have an effect on your design? Because you've introduced the community theater.
Mm-hmm.
How did that have, like, did you actually, I don't know, like, how did that help your design, or, I don't know, overall work in landscape architecture? Do you act your designs out? Like, I'm not sure how. Could you explain more on that? Like, how that impacted your work on the urban planning and landscape architecture?
Well, that is work in progress. And I'm interested to continue do these explorations. So for those of you who are interested in these type of projects, please tell me. we can do something together. In the end, it's it's not clear.
So it is like a research in progress.
Well, yes, but this is the same kind of difficulty that's shared by all charrette or community design processes, right? Because we talk about co-design. So in the end, after you've run all these public consultation exercises, including government consultation, they would have a list of all the public comments, And then, so after you list out all the public comments, in the end, you would rely on a professional to draw up the actual plan. So that is one way to look at it. In the smaller scale setting, say if you work in more rural areas or villages, or if you work in rural villages projects in different parts of the world, then there is more of the product or the outcome of actually building it in the end. Right? So you go through different discussion processes, and then you make some collective decisions, and then you build the village.
Yeah.
So I think there are some of these projects in Hong Kong. So Wei Zhen, for example, worked with the Choyin village villagers to create their own village. So I think in the smaller scale it's easier. In the urban scale, but I think in the urban scale that's perhaps more important, because we are we need to deal with capital.
Oh, yes.
And bureaucracy, which makes a lot of decisions on the urban landscape in the city that it's difficult to have a collective voice. So yeah, so I mean there are different projects that I have been working on and want to do. So more of that, and then also on the artistic side, there are a lot of these art projects. So street theater and different kinds of artistic work that has resulted from these discussions and processes.
Great. You have any more questions? I think that was a pretty interesting discussion.
Yeah.
Like a whole new perspective on design in general, like involving so many people, and it's apparent on the result of the discussion.
So maybe I can make just one maybe final point.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah, so the latest discussion I had on this is, well, if you search on Facebook, if you go to the CCCD Facebook page, there's a recording on the latest development of touch art. So touch art is basically like touch art.
Yeah.
so in short, it is basically initially a response to the dominance of visual culture. So if you go to a gallery, you look at the work, and then you're not supposed to touch it. Right? There's a sign saying that if you touch it, you're gonna get your hands chopped off.
Yeah.
So what's relied on for the visually impaired or blind people? There is something called oral description. Right, so you stand in front of the Mona Lisa, and then you listen to the audio that tells you. Yeah. So there's a woman standing in front of you who is smiling at you, something like that. Right. So about 10-15 years ago, we started this project called Touch Art. So initially, it was more so that the visually impaired people can enjoy and participate in the gallery museum experience, and then gradually we moved on to. And then we found a lot of these visually impaired people are actually very capable in creating their own art. Right? So it becomes from a reception to active creation, and then in the latest, in the more recent years, we try to give more and more voice and exposure to these visually impaired artists. Right? So that's the kind of the gist of touch art. But then there has been an issue that we have been discussing, or what is in my mind for a while, is the kind of aesthetics involved. Right? Because if we think of community art, there is, well, I don't know if you have that kind of impression, but basically, if you talk about community art, if you talk about collective kind of building of villages and things like that, you have this rustic kind of raw kind of design aesthetics, right? So it's like, well, if you go to a well, depending on how you call it, like a in informal housing, or if like shanty towns in a way. You have this very, people build their own houses, so we already have that. Like people organically build their own landscape and houses and their own shelters, right? So but then there is this kind of rustic aesthetic to it, right? Basically, it involves people who are not trained drawing Roman columns, and so they don't have that kind of high art aesthetic. So similar to both design and also in community art, there is this kind of understanding, the impression that there are the nice things, the high art, expensive things versus the collective, versus the community, versus what everybody wants to do. And I think there, for me, one of the things is to resolve, for me, it's important to resolve that kind of aesthetic. So that it doesn't mean that common people make ugly things. And it's valuable because they look ugly, because it's it's built by lay people. Right? If it's in the professional world, you have these people who are licensed, people who are making a lot of money, and they rely on that exclusion to create their territory. So it's so you have, I don't know. So you have these kind of professional planners who are specialized in doing community engagement, and then they treat the people as their target for engaging. So there's a bit of this contradiction and dilemma that's difficult to resolve. But in the end, I think it's not so much. It's not something that's unresolvable. I think there is this kind of need to justify that collective people can make nice things. So part of that involves giving them the tools and the power and the resources, so that these community creation are also nice and beautiful things, depending on how you call it, versus the very exclusive kind of high art versus. So that gets a little bit complicated, because it gets to understandings about talent. If your studio teacher tells you that you're not good at, your design is not nice. Well, I don't know what's the word it's not pretty, or what kind of vocabulary they use, right? Or your design is not good. Then
they usually say, give it another try. They're usually very nice, but you sort of know.
Yeah, so
that wording.
Sure. So that becomes something that is very interesting, and something that deserves a bit of thought, and whether there is an objective, whether it's objectively good and bad, or whether it's we're just looking at it from different perspective, which doesn't work all the time, right? If it's a bad design, then it's bad design. If it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. Versus if you're giving the power for everyone to create their own space, and then maybe the designer has the role to facilitate, right, to help people realize what they want to do. So, for example, if you are the assistant for a visually impaired artist, then there are some things that they're not so good at making, and you help them make what they want to make. Then it arrives at a different set of skills and responsibility, rather than creating your masterpiece, master designer art. It's about people creating things and be able to live in spaces that they want to live in. So yeah, that's kind of what I think about these days.
I think CCCD is a really like a great project that it sums up what we do as landscape architects because it involves everything, as you said, and it involves people. So it's a really great idea to get everybody involved in making art. So last but not least, since everyone listening to our podcast are our classmates and students studying in Hong Kong U landscape architecture, so are there any songs or even films that you like that you would like to recommend to our classmates when they're studying landscape architecture?
Okay, you. I didn't prepare for this question. Okay, this is totally random. Well, there are all the. Well, you can consult the film list from the. From their syllabus, you know, so those are all good films. I think what I use a lot in my kind of discussion of the informal housing versus the high-rise podium MTR is kind of Hollywood Hong Kong by Fu Chan. But what I have in mind is, let me try to see if I can. It's low tai fun. There is this theater, avant-garde theater piece that is called. Sorry for taking the time.
Yeah.
Okay, there's this avant-garde theater piece that we watched that had a performance in Hong Kong in the past year, like last year or something. That has absolutely no relevance to what we have been talking about, but it's called Directions to Servants. Lo Pei Fan. It's so it's a Japanese avant-garde theater piece that is just totally random.
It's okay. We'll link it into our blog so everyone can watch it.
Yeah, so it's about a group of servants in an empty house, and the master is gone, and then they start just doing these crazy things. And watch it. I don't know what that means. Well, there's probably there's a 1960s recording of an old version, and then there are some trailers.
It's probably on YouTube, right?
Yes, there are these 30-minute or 1-minute trailers, but I think you get a sense. I think that in a way is, when you leave a bunch of servants in an empty house, they start to make decisions, or chaotic things start to emerge.
Okay, so that is the end of our first episode of our studio radio podcast. Are there any stuff left you would like to say?
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for your
Thank you
time.
for coming.
I don't know if I was very coherent, but
we had some very good discussions over, and I don't think you had enough time maybe to talk about the stuff with the community designs and the community theaters in class, or you had very little time to do that. And it was good to hear that from this podcast. Like, we had more time to talk to you and get to know you more personally too. Yep. So lastly, because we have to thank you for your time and appearing on our first episode of our podcast. We have prepared some gifts for you, which is
Thank you, Carl.
Oh, thank you very much.
like a laser cutting bookmark.
Yes.
Smart.
Yay.
Hope you like it.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you.
And also thank you everyone for listening, and hope you all know more about the sector through Yin-Lun's story today.